Good. Bueno, pues buenas tardes. Me da muchísimo gusto estar aquí para darles la bienvenida a la cátedra Mario Ojeda, que organiza el Colegio de México. Darle la bienvenida a Bruce Jones, que es el director del Brookings Institution. Y bueno, agradecerle al CEI, en especial, bueno, a través de su director Jean-François Prudhomme, pero a todo el CEI, la organización de este evento, que es un evento, pues a final de cuentas, del centro. No están los hijos el hijo de Mario, ¿verdad? No ha llegado el hijo de Mario. Bueno, porque para los que no sepan, el hijo de Mario Ojeda también es especialista en temas internacionales y había dicho que vendría, supongo que llegará un poco más tarde. Pero bueno, un poco de historia. Esta cátedra Mario Ojeda nace como un homenaje póstumo al profesor emérito del Centro de Estudios Internacionales. Nace en 2013 con apoyo de la Fundación Colmex y inicia realmente trabajos en 2014. Después de lo cual ha sido regular, a excepción del año pasado, que por causas de los sismos de septiembre, pues se tuvo que cancelar. El objetivo de la cátedra, bueno, por una parte es convocar académicos de gran prestigio y reconocimiento internacional en el ámbito de las relaciones internacionales, pero sobre todo tiene como objetivo abrir un espacio entre estudiantes y académicos del CEI para que puedan interactuar y establecer vínculos, potencialmente redes con los ponentes invitados. La conferencia magistral que se dicta se publica en la revista de Foro Internacional, que es la revista del Centro de Estudios Internacionales. Y bueno, pues creo que no necesito hacerles gran historia de quién fue Mario Ojeda. No solamente fue presidente del colegio y alguien que tuvo pues una gran participación en la consolidación de instituciones de investigación en México, como el Colegio de Michoacán, el Colegio de la Frontera Norte y el Colegio de Sonora, sino pues también uno de los estudiosos más notables de las relaciones internacionales, en particular en lo que se refiere a política exterior de México. Entre su obra más destacada, que está el libro Alcances y Límites de la Política Exterior de México, que lleva 6 ediciones y que sigue siendo un libro de texto, por ejemplo, utilizado en la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM en la carrera, y además tiene otros 12 libros, 70 artículos académicos y 100 trabajos de divulgación. Mario Ojeda fue alguien que promovió el estudio de las relaciones bilaterales con Estados Unidos, Centroamérica y América Latina, enfocándose en entender el sistema internacional y el lugar de México. Y voy a leer una frase que tengo aquí textual de la conocida fórmula Ojeda, que creo que sigue más vigente hoy después de todo lo que está pasando y es bueno traerla a estos días para explicar las relaciones entre México y Estados Unidos. Los Estados Unidos, y cito, abro comillas, los Estados Unidos reconocen y aceptan la necesidad de México a disentir de la política estadounidense en todo aquello que le resulte fundamental a México, aunque para los Estados Unidos sea importante, mas no fundamental. A cambio de ello, México brinda su cooperación en todo aquello que, siendo fundamental o aún importante para los Estados Unidos, no lo es para el país. Y ahora creo que temas como el de seguridad, narcotráfico, migración, pues traen nuevos retos en términos de esa agenda o no compartida, y entre esta idea de escoger entre conciliar o mantener una línea antiintervencionista y la autonomía del gobierno mexicano. Bueno, finalmente, para cerrar estas breves palabras introductorias, pues diría que la cátedra como mencioné, es un homenaje al trabajo de no solamente un profesor emérito, sino alguien muy relevante en la historia del colegio, presidente del Colegio de México, que espero que sea un espacio que se continúe y que se apoye. Y tengo un último mensaje para Bruce, aprovechando que lo tenemos aquí. Como yo decía, Bruce Jones es presidente director del Instituto Brookings, y creo que el Colegio de México, if I speak in Spanish, you understand what I said? Okay. Okay, I'll switch to English because I really want you to understand what I'm going to say. So I do think that el Colegio de México and Brookings Institution, pero ya lo vas a decir en inglés, that el Colegio de México and Brookings Institution share several things, and I don't know to what extent you have acknowledged that. First, we share this ideal as one of the aims of both institutions of concentrated and innovative research, in-depth research, very rigorous in terms of methods, but with a public policy perspective and open to this dialogue with public policy makers. Second, we share a similar research agenda, not only on international relations, but in other topics such as urban development, poverty, global issues, Asian and African studies, and the place of Latin America or the Americas in the larger global context. And finally, we share the value of autonomous academic positions that allow us to do autonomous research. No? So I hope that these three coincidences are seen as a fertile field to keep on building further collaborations with the Brookings Institution. Welcome to el Colegio de México.
Muchas gracias, Silvia. Ahora que estamos hablando del profesor Ojeda, estamos conmemorando su presencia y sus realizaciones aquí en la institución. Entre los intereses del profesor Ojeda podemos mencionar por lo menos tres. Uno inicial, que tiene que ver con su tesis de licenciatura en los años 50 en la Escuela de Ciencias Políticas de la UNAM, que fue un trabajo sobre migrantes mexicanos en Texas. Y para llevar a cabo ese trabajo, realizó durante varios meses un trabajo de campo en el cual entrevistó a migrantes. Y eso es muy importante porque es algo que le hizo tomar conciencia de la importancia de conocer mejor a Estados Unidos y de trabajar sobre esa realidad que implica asimetría en la relación de poder. La segunda cosa, y que se deriva de eso, y es algo muy interesante que cuenta en un libro de memorias que difundió de manera muy limitada, cuenta un viaje que hizo en coche desde Toronto, donde había ido a trabajar en 1940 y algo, hasta México. Y ahí hay una toma de conciencia de lo que es América del Norte y una toma de conciencia de la importancia, y lo menciono ahora por el título de la conferencia, de la importancia de la geopolítica en las relaciones internacionales. Bien, aquí están llegando Mario, bienvenido, y Sebastián, que son el hijo y el nieto del profesor Ojeda. Bien, entonces, me toca presentar a Bruce Jones. Como se ha dicho, es vicepresidente y director del programa de estudios de política exterior de la Brookings, y es también el miembro principal del proyecto de esa institución sobre la estrategia y el orden internacional. Es también profesor asociado al Freeman Spogli Institute de la Universidad de Stanford y es el presidente del Consejo Asesor del Centro sobre la Cooperación Internacional en la Universidad de Nueva York. Entre sus intereses de investigación están fundamentalmente, primero, temas de seguridad internacional. Sus intereses de investigación actuales están asociados a la estrategia de Estados Unidos en el sistema internacional, el tema del orden internacional y el tema de las potencias emergentes. Su libro más reciente sobre ese tema se llama Still Ours to Lead, America, Rising Powers and the Tension Between Rivalry and Restraint. Ha sido autor con Carlos Pascual, que fue embajador, se acordarán, durante poco tiempo, pero fue embajador de Estados Unidos aquí en México. Entonces, coautor con Carlos Pascual y Steven Stedman de un libro que se llama Power and Responsibility, Building International Order in an Era of Transnational Threats. También trabaja temas que están en la intersección entre la geopolítica y la revolución energética. Es coautor de un libro que se publicó hace pocos años que se llama Risk Pivot, Great Powers, International Security and the Energy Revolution. Tiene también una experiencia larga y mucha expertise en los temas de intervención y gestión de crisis a nivel internacional. Ha participado en misiones de Naciones Unidas en Kosovo y ha sido asistente especial del coordinador especial también de Naciones Unidas en el proceso de paz de Medio Oriente. Ha escrito sobre Ruanda, ha escrito sobre la cooperación para la paz y la seguridad y ha tenido posiciones de consultor para el Departamento de Estado de Estados Unidos y para el Banco Mundial sobre el tema de los estados frágiles. Tiene también una larga experiencia en instituciones multilaterales, coopera o escrito en varios medios de comunicación como CNN, la BBC, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, National Public Radio, The Huffington Post, etcétera, etcétera. Y finalmente, tengo que mencionar que tiene un doctorado de la London School of Economics y que ha sido miembro o asociado un Hamburg Fellow en la Universidad de Stanford sobre el tema de la prevención de conflictos. Sin más, le doy la palabra a Bruce. Sí, Silvia se va a bajar porque...
Thank you both very, very much for having me here. It's an honor and a privilege to be here at the Colegio de Mexico. I've already learned to just say Colmex. And it's a real privilege to speak as part of the Cátedra Mario Ojeda and to be part of that tradition here. So thank you both for inviting me and for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back in Mexico City. Things have changed since I was here last time, so I'll be interested to hear more from all of you in the audience about your perceptions about how things have developed. What we had discussed is that I would speak a little bit about two subjects that sort of intersect. One is the changing patterns of great power relations of geopolitics. I think we're in a period of very rapid change in geopolitics, and I'll say some things about that, and then talk a little bit about how I see what I call constructive players, middle powers, multilateral institutions, some philanthropic or corporate sectors trying to respond to and limit the scope for geopolitical competition that we see unfolding. And it's a bit of a tension between these two themes. We were talking this morning, one part of the world which is moving rapidly towards a kind of a nationalist geopolitical framework, zero-sum, another part of the world which is very much still modeled on interdependence, global governance, et cetera, and a kind of growing tension between those two. So I'll spend a bit of time on each and the interrelationship between them. And then we can have a discussion about sort of any aspect that's of interest. To set it up, what I'll do is I'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about how the international system has evolved, just really very, very briefly to get us to the current period. Then I'll spend a little bit of time on how I see the strategies of the two most important players in the international system now, the United States and China. And I'll make an argument about why I think those are the two most important to discuss. and then briefly talk about how the rest of the kind of major players are responding to this changing geopolitical situation. I'll often refer to the G20. I don't necessarily mean the institution or the kind of summit of the G20. I mean that group of top economies that are essentially the most important players in the global economics and increasingly in geopolitics. And then I'll switch and talk about a number of different ways that I see groups of countries or groups of cities or groups of corporate actors or other collections of these, as I described, constructive players trying to respond and find their way through this changing geopolitical landscape. I usually try to be upbeat and optimistic in my talks. I'm not entirely sure I will be today, but we can explore together what the balance between the more worrying phenomenon and the more constructive phenomenon is. Very briefly, if we look at the kind of evolution of the international system in the post-war period. You go back to 1945 and the United States and the United Kingdom coming out of World War II set out a vision and the infrastructure of an international system based on the UN. And in 45 and 46, there was a first effort to use the UN as a tool in the reconstruction of Europe, and that fails very rapidly. It fails because of the kind of rapid deterioration in US-Soviet relations. And the effort to use the UN as the framework for the reconstruction of Europe breaks down. And already by 1947, the US has retreated to a more narrow framework for international order based on NATO. The Marshall Plan then is the instrument for the reconstruction, which is an American-led plan rather than a UN plan, and a strategy premised in American thinking on defense of the free world against the Soviets. From the very beginning, with the Marshall Plan and beyond there, it's always in American thinking twinned with free market access or market economics, which is heavily in the American commercial interest to promote, but is also seen as being part of a kind of win-win economics within the Western sphere during that Cold War period. Multilateral institutions like the UN and GATT play important roles, but subsidiary roles to a Cold War framework, which was really the structure of international politics during the Cold War. And outside of the West, the United States and the Soviet Union intervene, proxy warfare, all sorts of nasty things that they do outside of their respective spheres. Fundamental change in the structure of international politics at the end of the Cold War, where we moved to a situation where the United States is really the only credible superpower, the hyperpower, whatever terminology we want to use, and is in essentially a unipolar moment, and adopts a global strategy, not a Western strategy, adopts a global strategy designed to push the institutions of liberalism, the institutions of the Western world to a much broader array of actors. NATO, I think, sort of reduces in salience. The UN increases in salience. We have the shift from the GATT to the WTO, and very importantly, the major economies that had stood outside of the global economy during the Cold War enter into the global economy. Mexico is actually an early actor, joining the OECD and beginning to open, and then slightly after that, China, India, Brazil, and many, many others start to open into the Western economy, and you have a shift to a mode where you're talking sort of real terms about global economics and the underpinning of that. 9/11 sort of interferes with this in a way, pushes quite a lot of American money and material and intervention into the Middle East and into the global war on terror, but it doesn't actually derail the strategy as a whole. And the kind of a global strategy continues, and the relationship between BRICS and the United States, the emerging powers in the West, evolves. What really begins to change things, I think, is the global financial crisis, which changes the texture of politics in the West, or begins to, and changes the balance of power in global economic terms between the West and the rising powers, and in particular puts China into a much more significant position than it had been prior to that stage. And you have the beginnings of people talking about the emergence of a multipolar world. We'd been in a unipolar world, Cold War bipolar, then unipolar, and then the emergence in people's vocabulary of a multipolar world. I think President Obama was intellectually well-oriented to the concept of a multipolar world. He had an instinctive appreciation for the shift in the dynamics of American power. In parts of his strategy and parts of his policy, tried to implement a vision of a kind of a multipolar world with global governance, but very much resisted in the American security establishment, which doesn't think in those terms and doesn't think comfortably about global governance or multilateralism. And so there's a kind of disjuncture between Obama and the American political establishment during his tenure, and doesn't really succeed. And rather than seeing out of the, I should have said that the global financial crisis, in addition, it's so important is the response of the G20 to the management of the global financial crisis, to the kind of forging of the G20 in response to the crisis, and the experience of working with a wider set of actors to respond to a crisis of that scale creates a kind of an expectation or a hope or a possibility of a benign multipolarity, a kind of win-win global governance G20 kind of world, which doesn't really take hold. And I think we have to be realistic in assessing over the last 10 years that that is not really what we have seen take hold. It did, for a long period of time, hold back protectionism. It did create a framework for great power relations to a degree, but we have seen progressively a kind of G20 world eroding and the emergence of much more sort of old-fashioned, traditional, negative geopolitical dynamics and geopolitical competitive dynamics between the major players. I actually think at this point in time, we should stop talking about a multipolar world. I don't think it's an accurate depiction of the world that we're in or the world we're heading to. I think we are headed to a bipolar world. I think that the power basis of the United States and the power basis of China are so much larger than everybody else, and the ability of the United States and the ability of China to influence and affect political, security, economic, and other decisions in almost every region of the world on almost every issue is very substantial and simply of an order of magnitude greater than any other actor in the international system. We're not at a fully bipolar system yet. The United States is still more powerful by most measures in most domains than China, but China's catching up very, very rapidly. And that the distance between China and the United States in meaningful terms and the other actors is, I think, increasingly apparent. So I want to focus on the strategies of the United States, the strategies of China, and then I'll touch more lightly on others, and then we'll turn to more benign topics. And it's a difficult time to talk about American strategy because the United States is in a moment of massive confusion and nonsense and God knows what the hell we're doing. But I will try to elucidate some of the dynamics that I see in current American thinking, partly to try to elucidate what of what we're watching is about Trump and what of what we're watching is about a deeper change in American strategic thinking. And I think it's actually much more the latter than the former. Then I'll also talk about China, where we've seen a fundamental shift in strategy, and then the intersection between those two plays out across a range of issues. I think to understand Trump, you have to understand that he has, for his entire adult life, been skeptical of the alliance system, which was kind of bulwark of American strategy in the post-war period, and he's been skeptical of free trade. He genuinely believes that the United States is getting ripped off because of free trade and the alliance arrangements. So he's a deep skeptic about those things. He's also, to use a very sophisticated international relations term, he's a bully. And his negotiating tactic is not multilateral, it's not even unilateral, it's kind of hyper-unilateral. It's a screw you, or I'm walking away, you get me what I want, or I'm leaving kind of negotiating strategy, which he's done his whole business career, and now he's applying to American strategy. So you think about a kind of bully unilateralist who doesn't believe in the alliance system and doesn't believe in free trade. That's the president. But the United States is still a country of institutions, and it's a country of political parties and of elites, and all of those matter to the articulation of policy. And this plays out differently in different areas. But to put it simply, the American political establishment and the American security establishment and the American financial establishment reject Donald Trump's worldview completely. I mean, completely. And that is true of his defense secretary, of his secretary of state, of his chief of staff, of his finance minister, just name it, across the whole national security cabinet, across the kind of upper layers of government. American institutions are staffed by people who fundamentally reject the worldview of the President of the United States. They don't necessarily reject his unilateralism. The United States has a kind of uncomfortable relationship to multilateralism. It often does things multilaterally, even while expressing a kind of unilateralist rhetoric, but it's uncomfortable with multilateralism. So when Donald Trump says, screw this agreement, or screw that agreement, or I'm tearing up the, yeah, the establishment doesn't mind that too much, because it doesn't really deeply believe in multilateral institutions. It doesn't really deeply trust multilateral institutions. So the unilateralism of Trump, he can get away with that. The anti-alliance view is completely rejected. And the anti-free trade view is broadly rejected, although that's more of an issue because free trade has always been a bit more politically debated in the United States. So you have a president who has very strong worldviews and a team around him who completely reject his worldviews. And what we see in American policy is a struggle between those two things playing out differently in different spaces. Do it very quickly. In Asia, if you listen to President Trump during the campaign, he would have essentially walked away from the alliance structure in Asia. That is not the policy that we are implementing. We are implementing a policy of the alliance structure in Asia. Defense of Japan, defense of Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a kind of deep alliance policy that we are implementing. And the President of the United States isn't that influential in American Asia policy right now. Trade war with China, yes. Everything else, that's not really the President. That's the security establishment and the political establishment implementing a traditional American forward policy. Europe, where the President has stronger instincts than he does on Asia, we're seeing two policies. The President has a policy, which is kind of anti-EU, anti-Germany, anti-European. And the institutions in the establishment have a policy which is pro-Germany, pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Europe. And both are being implemented. And we can't pretend that either one is not real. There are more American troops in NATO in Europe now than there were when Trump took office. You would never know that from Trump's rhetoric, or from his statements, or from what he said about NATO, or what he said about Germany, or et cetera. He says these things, and the administration ignores them and implements a NATO policy, which is deeply confusing if you're a German policymaker, I can assure you. The Middle East is the only place where the political establishment and the president sort of align. They don't really align on tactics, but they do align on strategy. Because one of the oddities of American policy, and I can explain why it's of interest, is a kind of deep sentiment about Iran as the kind of source of all evil in the Middle East. It's an exaggerated view in my take, but it is a very widely held view in the United States, and it's also the president's view. So on the Middle East, the president sees a kind of go after Iran everywhere we can find them strategy, and the establishment is largely sympathetic to that strategy. So you see a kind of convergence between the president and the institutions in the Middle East, which I think is quite dangerous. I want to be very frank about Mexico and also sort of more broadly Latin America, and when I talk about these dynamics. The simple fact of the matter is there is no strategy on Mexico, and there is no strategy on Latin America, okay? There are a lot of people at State Department or the intelligence community or DoD who are very knowledgeable about Mexico or are very knowledgeable about South America, or et cetera. But it is a blank spot in the strategic thinking of the United States, if I'm frank about it. The strategic thinking of the United States is fundamentally grounded in the alliance structure. Almost everything that we do in international politics starts with the alliance structure. And since the alliance structure is essentially in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and not in Latin America, it doesn't really, there is not a deep sense of strategy vis-a-vis Latin America. And what that means is that the president's instincts are the dominant source of policy, because the institutions and the establishment don't have a strong worldview on Latin America. When the president says stupid things on Germany, the entire system rallies to push back on him and implement a sensible policy. When the president says, hey, I know what, I'm going to completely renegotiate NAFTA, well, the institutions don't really stop him. I'll come back to NAFTA. But it's just in a kind of crude sense, when you're looking south of the Texan border, there is no strategy in any meaningful sense of that term. Asia is now the core of American strategy and strategic thinking. It's not the Middle East, it's not terrorism, it's not that, it's Asia, and that's a kind of increasing phenomenon. And what it means is that if we think about international order, or we think about geopolitics, we don't think first and foremost about the Middle East, we have to think first and foremost about the relationship between the United States and Asia. And increasingly what that means is a relationship between the United States and China. So then I want to turn to Chinese strategy. And I think what we've seen in Chinese strategy over the last several years is a fundamental shift from where Hu Jintao and his predecessors were to where Xi Jinping is, a fundamental shift. We went from a long period of time, which Hu Jintao was the kind of exemplar of a strategy which was premised on stability, 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 stability. Stability was the absolutely necessary condition for Chinese economic growth, which was the necessary condition for poverty reduction, which was the necessary condition for the continued legitimacy of the Communist Party in China. And those were overweening priorities. And everything that Hu Jintao did was designed to make sure that there was stability in the international system so that China could get on with the business of growing rapidly and solving poverty, and et cetera. That is not what Hu Jintao was doing. Hu Jintao was doing something fundamentally different. I'm sorry, Xi Jinping, thank you, yes. Yeah, that was a very useful correction, thank you. It's been a long day. Xi Jinping is implementing a very different strategy. Now, rhetorically, when he shows up at Davos, at the G20, he sounds like he's a multilateralist, he's pro-free trade, he's pro-globalization, he's going to be a champion of climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, we're watching a very different Chinese strategy being implemented. A intense, rapid intensification of militarization of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. A massive buildup of Chinese military capability and investment in advanced military technology and the application of new technologies to Chinese military capacity. Huge pressure being placed on smaller countries in East Asia to toe the line with Beijing and to kind of walk away from American relationships. The use of direct political interference, bribery, manipulation, et cetera, in Australia, New Zealand, other kinds of places. Little bits of that in the United States too, though not as much. A growing tactical alliance with Russia. Not a strategic alliance. Russia and China don't trust each other, but a growing tactical alliance designed to find opportunities to weaken the West and working very closely together on some of these issues. The use of Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes for market issues, sometimes for kind of genuine infrastructure investments, but sometimes increasingly as a tool of political pressure on countries to cause them to shift their geopolitical posture or to create the kind of infrastructure for Chinese basing rights, East Africa, Central America, other places as well. That's to say nothing of the internal issues. The waiving of term limits around Xi Jinping at the 19th People's Congress, an intense crackdown on intellectual dissent within China. Much more so than under Hu Jintao or his predecessors, an intense crackdown on intellectual dissent. And that's, again, to say nothing of the human rights issues of Xinjiang and other places where the kind of anti-Uyghur, anti-Muslim crackdown is of an extraordinary scale inside China. And now we're also seeing a very deliberate strategy of exporting facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and other tracking technologies to authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, and a kind of growing communication among those regimes about how to use those technologies for suppressing dissent and suppressing opposition. So you have a Chinese strategy, and I should say, I think the Chinese strategy, it's partly the simple personality shift. Personalities matter in international politics between Hu and Xi. It's also the fact that the global financial crisis showed a core weakness in the West. And what Xi Jinping coming into office saw that there were deep weaknesses in the West, and everything we've seen in the West since just elaborates these weaknesses. We'd be kind of digging around holes. And what do you do when confronted by a competitor who's in a moment of weakness? You take advantage, right? In geopolitics, that's what you do. You take advantage. And that's what Xi Jinping is doing, is taking advantage of a moment of weakness to try to push the West. If I'm very blunt, I think it's reasonably clear that Chinese strategy at core is to push the United States out of Asia as the kind of dominant power in Asia. But I think she has larger ambitions as well. And the more you read about internal decision-making in the Communist Party, and the more you read about the inside debates inside Xi's office, it's pretty clear that they have a very ambitious strategy about where they're heading vis-a-vis the United States and international order. So you have a United States that is in a moment of sort of hyper-unilateralism, and I think at a moment where it's dissatisfied by the nature of the multilateral arrangements around it. And you have a China which is trying to take advantage of the current moment to push a much more assertive strategy. And the combination between those two things is getting very tense and very difficult. And there are a whole host of flashpoints from the East China Sea to the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula and onwards. And we're seeing a very substantial ratcheting up of tensions on both sides. Where Trump is different than any other actor in the US is in bringing the economic issues into it. Left to their own devices, the national security establishment in the United States, the political establishment, would be doing exactly what we're doing now in terms of the pushback on China in Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, etc. But we would not be launching a trade war. The trade war is specific to Trump and based on his sort of wacky 1950s worldview about global economics. So that's sort of specific to Trump and may go away. But the broader phenomenon of a China that is moving towards a much more assertive stance vis-a-vis the United States, and a United States that's moving to a much more assertive stance vis-a-vis China, those are deep phenomena that are not going away with the passage of Donald Trump. Those are now, I think, structural realities of international politics. We are not yet at a phase where China and the United States are in a new Cold War. Remember 10 years ago, people were worried about a G2. We were worried that the United States and China were going to cooperate and they were going to kind of stitch these deals together and impose those deals on everybody. That is not our problem. We're much closer to a new Cold War than we are to a G2. We are not yet locked into it. And I think the kind of critical point is that there is still fluidity. There is still a debate inside the United States about how far to push, and there's a debate inside Xi Jinping's office about how far to push this kind of increasing tension. She was very surprised by Trump and extremely surprised by the trade war, and it's caused him, I think, some degree of hesitancy about how far along they've gone. But those two actors are now locked into, I think, a very competitive relationship. We don't know yet whether it will be a conflictual relationship, but there's a big risk that it will. I think then for it to step back, if we look at the rest of the G20, I would single out one actor, which is Russia, which is playing a very deliberately negative role, seeking to undermine institutions, undermine the West, undermine NATO, cause trouble, create dissension, weaken the West wherever it can. It's playing a very negative role. I think everybody else is in a different place. And whether I talk about Japan or India or Saudi or Mexico or Brazil or whatever, I think everybody else is looking at this, trying to figure out what the hell is going on in Washington, trying to figure out really what's going on in Beijing, and what on earth is going to happen between these two giants. And everybody else is engaged in a strategy, again, to use a technical international relations term, best referred to as dating. Nobody's really forging new relations, but everybody's kind of flirting and hedging and trying to figure out exactly who's up and who's down. India and Japan are trying to deepen their relationship on some issues, Russia and Saudi on some issues. Everybody's trying to find kind of new relations and patterns of relationships that can sort of limit their exposure to the changing dynamics in Washington and in Beijing and in the intersection between them. So it's a kind of a hedging strategy to the extent that it's strategy at all. And I think we'll be seeing that for some time. I don't anticipate that US-China relations will solidify into a new pattern anytime soon. I think there'll be a lot of fluidity and variability in it for some period of time, partly because Washington is so completely screwed up that it's not as if you can implement a kind of coherent policy consistently. It's, like this. So it won't be clear what the strategy is, though I would be very confident that it remains a strategy of deepening the pushback against China. Bon, so we have a growing tension in geopolitics and a kind of rapid erosion of any kind of win-win system of global governance and a return to a much more traditional kind of 19th century geopolitical space in strategic affairs. So what do people do about it? What are we seeing in terms of the response? And I'll go pretty quickly through this because then we should open up into discussion and take the discussion however you want to go. What I'm seeing, in addition to this kind of hedging among the kind of major powers, what I'm seeing is a variety of kinds of response from what I call the constructive players, the actors who are trying to limit the extent to which we fall back into a Cold War, limit the extent to which we erode win-win, limit the extent that we walk back from globalization, et cetera. And this is happening at the level of states, and it's happening at the level of sub-state actors. And I'll touch briefly on both. At the level of states, I haven't quite yet given up on the G20 as a mechanism for kind of stabilizing and limiting the scope of kind of bad behavior by the United States and the Chinese. I'm not super optimistic about the G20, but I haven't totally given up on it. It has some key strengths. It has a success story in its recent past. The management of the global financial crisis was a pretty big deal. The G20 was central to that. It has all the key players at the table. It has, I think, the very substantial disadvantage of the rotating presidency. If we were going to choose, you would not have picked right now to ask Argentina to be in the kind of highlight of geopolitics and trying to manage US-China relations. That would not be your best move. I'm not sure you would go next to Tokyo to think about how to handle these issues, though I think Tokyo will do a decent job. And I certainly wouldn't go after that to Riyadh, who has the presidency of the G20 after Japan. So this kind of bouncing around presidencies makes the G20 a complete hostage to fortune about the specific politics of who happens to be in power in those countries at a given point of time, and that's, I think, a core weakness of the mechanism. The second mechanism, which potentially is interesting, is something which was kind of born in Berlin, called the Alliance of Multilaterals, or Multilateralists. And this is born as a German, Canadian, Japanese initiative to kind of align their foreign policies. These are three pretty important players on the world stage, below the level of the top military powers, pretty important middle powers. The idea is to align their strategies in defense of the multilateral system. That's not a bad idea, I think, at core. It has, in my mind, two fundamental problems. First, given where we are in our contemporary history, it would have been so much better if this had been a mechanism that had been born not only in the West. If you had had an alliance of multilateralists born in Berlin, Delhi, and Tokyo, I would feel more optimistic about its chances of success than something which is born in the traditional West. Second, if we're frank about it, the major multilateral institutions right now are not very well organized to tackle the major challenges in front of us. So it's nice in principle to defend multilateralism, but in practice, the key multilateral institutions are not performing very well. And they're not performing well for two basic reasons. One, many of them don't have the right membership, they don't have the right governance structures. But two, they are not actually well adapted to the threats that we confront or the challenges that we confront. Threats evolve and challenges evolve. Institutions have to catch up, and they haven't been, frankly. And that's true kind of across the board of the institutions. I spend a lot of time thinking about issues like civil war and failed states, fragile states, et cetera. In the post-Cold War period, and the kind of period from about 92 until about 2010, the UN actually proved quite successful at managing civil wars and adapting to perform that role. The UN is completely irrelevant to the management of proxy warfare that involves the great powers because they simply block action in the Security Council. Can't do anything about it. The WTO is simply not geared to manage high-tech globalization in the contemporary moment. It doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have the right kind of people serving there. Just go institution to institution. They are misaligned with the threats that we confront, to say nothing of the fact that there is no forum, no framework for dealing with cyber, artificial intelligence, you just name it, any new technology, there is no framework for dealing with these things. So again, I think in principle, it's good to have a collection of middle powers rising to the defense of multilateralism, but the institutions themselves are profoundly weak. That is starting then to produce a return to an older debate, and you're beginning to see sort of burblings around a kind of return to a debate around an alliance of democracies. Some of you will remember that in the kind of 97, 98, 2000 period, there was a lot of debate around creating a club of democracies. At a point in time when the United States thought it ruled the world and it could just establish clubs of democracies and everybody would fall in line, and that turned out to be not so simple. But there is again a return to a discussion of clubs of democracies or alliance of democracies or mechanisms among the democracies. What's called the D10 has gained a lot more traction in the last couple of years. That's the G7 plus Australia, South Korea, and India. And they work pretty closely now in the D10 format. There's an intensification of effort among what are called the Five Eyes, which is a major intelligence sharing mechanism in the West. And you're starting to see, for me, this is the most interesting point, in the Indian foreign policy debate. It was India that was the most profoundly opposed to a club of democracies in the 2000 period because it would have put it in direct opposition with China. India is in direct opposition with China. And they accept that there is no alternative to that at this stage. And so you're beginning to see in the Indian debate a reference consistently to what they call values-based multilateralism. Values-based multilateralism is the Indian Foreign Service code for an alliance of democracies, just cast in slightly more polite terminology. So these things are beginning to burble, and that would put us into a position where you have a kind of a new alignment of democracies on the one hand and authoritarian powers on the other, with lots of countries left with extremely difficult choices about where to align. I don't know how far along that axis we will go, but there's a lot of firmament in that. At the same time, we're also seeing these very dynamic and interesting movements among actors who are still living the reality of interdependence. Major international corporations, large cities, megacities, and major states like California, or sort of states of sub-state actors within the international system, and multilateral institutions, who recognize that everything they do and all of their economic activity and their security activity is predicated on a cooperative multilateral system, and are very nervous about the breakdown of that system, and or motivated by the specific issues around which they've mobilized. We've seen very interesting dynamics of city-to-city action on migration. We're seeing extremely interesting partnerships between cities, states, private sector, and multilateral institutions on climate change. The Global Climate Action Summit that just happened in California was a pretty important mechanism of mobilizing commitments and action below the level of national government. And I think that's going to be quite an important mechanism in keeping climate negotiations and climate discussions alive, even while the United States is in its particularly bizarre unilateralist moment. I think we saw a very interesting version of this actually on the NAFTA negotiations in the United States, where, again, I said the president has his sort of worldview, and their institutions were not particularly mobilized to check him on that. But we saw a very interesting coalition of cities, states, private sector leaders, and to a certain extent civic leaders sort of emerge to pressure the president into a more constructive posture on those negotiations. And I think we're going to see more and more of this, linking megacities, linking major corporations. We've seen corporations taking a very important leadership role on the Sustainable Development Goals, even at a point in time when kind of politically those have lost some degree of salience. And this is a phenomenon that is not limited to the West. In the Global Climate Action Summit, the most important private sector convener was the Mahindra Group out of India. It wasn't a Western company, it was an Indian company that was the kind of key private sector partner to Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Brown and Patricia Espinosa. So you had a multilateral institution, happens to have a Mexican at the head, by the way, and an Indian company and an American mayor and an American state coming together to create a framework for action on climate change. Now, there are obvious limits to these things, right? That coalition can't overturn President Trump's decision to renegotiate Paris. That coalition of mayors can't stop the President of the United States or whomever else from putting national caps on refugees or on migrants. But it can create solution sets that can change the politics over time. I watch this very closely in the European context. If you think back to 2 or 3 years ago when the first wave of Syrian refugees came into Europe, and a huge national backlash in Germany and Stockholm and elsewhere, what changed the politics was cities. Cities and private sector actors finding solutions for how refugees would be integrated into the labor force and integrated into the housing structures and integrated into the education structures, which meant that from a national crisis, it relatively quickly sort of moved into a implementable, manageable problem set at the city level. And that just took the temperature away from the political debate and allowed for a kind of much more constructive political debate in Europe. Hasn't happened in the United States, but it did in Europe. In the United States, I think the climate space has been the one where the sort of sub-state actors have been very important. I want to wrap up. I think the issue that is coming up where these dynamics will interact in the most interesting way is infrastructure. Sounds like a very technical term, but infrastructure investment has become a major tool of Chinese strategy. Historically, it was a major tool of American strategy. We're going to see a lot of competition in the infrastructure space. Japan is playing a role, China's playing a role, the United States, Europe, et cetera. But infrastructure is a space where governments cannot implement without the private sector. It can't be done. There is no such thing as a government infrastructure plan. It's government finance or blended finance, but you always have private sector and government sector mixed. And what we're seeing is that in the private sector, there's no interest in this kind of clash of titans approach. The private sector is still trying to find cooperative solutions. At this point in history, the most surprising thing that I could think of is a China-Japan agreement on anything. Well, 3 weeks ago, China and Japan struck an agreement on, guess what? Co-investment in infrastructure. Because Japanese firms put their government under huge pressure to create opportunities for them to co-invest on infrastructure with the Chinese. So infrastructure starts to emerge as this very interesting space where from a kind of national security perspective, it's seen as part of the geopolitical prism, but from the private sector perspective, it's seen as win-win economics. And I think we're going to see this tussle out. The Japanese are going to make infrastructure a key theme of their G20, and these issues will be very much in play. There are tons of problems with these kind of constructive responses that I talked about. There are huge coordination problems, there are collective action problems, there are all kinds of problems. The most important of the problems is that, okay, not everybody would agree with this perspective, I recognize, but in many issue spaces over the last 25 years, if you were building a collective action approach or a multilateral approach, at some point along the food chain of policy, the United States would have played a constructive role. Sometimes they play a unilateral role, sometimes they're obnoxious, sometimes we intervene in stupid ways. But if you look at the articulation of any major multilateral institution, any major cooperative framework for action over the course of the last 25 years, someplace along the way, you would have had American power leaning into the construction of that mechanism. It's not so clear to me that that's what we'll have right now. So you're trying to create sort of win-win cooperative arrangements and multilateral arrangements despite the United States, not with the United States, and that's a much tougher business. So these issues are now going to play out in front of us. I suspect we will see, I'm quite certain that we will see an intensification of geopolitical rivalry. I anticipate that we will also see an intensification of these efforts by constructive actors to limit the scope of that deterioration of global governance. And it's going to be a race, and it'll be interesting to see who wins in the coming competition. So let me maybe stop there, and we can open up into whatever areas are of interest.
Bien, pues muchísimas gracias, Bruce. Bueno, hay muchos temas sobre la mesa. Pueden intervenir en español o si quieren, no hay ningún problema. Entonces lo que vamos a hacer es tomar quizás 3 preguntas, luego tener una respuesta y hacer varias rondas. Veo muchas manos alzadas, me parece muy bien. Mónica Serrano, ¿o quieres que...? No, ven, Mónica. Sí.
Es una rapidísima.
Sí, sí.
You mentioned that alliances have somehow mitigated the negative impact of the hyper-unilateralism of Trump. how would you explain the relationship with Canada, given that you are sitting next to a Canadian?
No, you know, he's Canadian.
Oh, you're Canadian too. I didn't know that.
Ok, detrás, vamos a empezar. Sí. Ilse, ahí con los estudiantes primero. Sí, sí, ok.
Sí, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Aprovechando los titulares, el G20, pues el estrellato se lo está llevando Xi Jinping y Trump. Peña se va, Temer se va, Merkel se va, Macri está destruido, Macron también está muy débil, May ni se diga. Y parece que por la personalidad de Trump tan volátil, tan inmadura, fácilmente se vería influenciado por Xi Jinping si lo puede seducir correctamente. Y a pesar de que el secretario Ross puede ser tan pro libre comercio como cualquiera, sigue siendo muchas de las decisiones de Trump las que ahora hace mandar tweets sobre General Motors. Así que es posible que en esta reunión del G20 Xi Jinping pueda seducir lo suficientemente bien a Trump como para que le baje siquiera con las tarifas.
Bien, y pasamos ahí. Sí, Ilse, sí.
Okay, so I'm Sophia from International Relations. Approaching or addressing actually this bipolar worldview that you described several times during your exposition, I find it really interesting for 2 points. First one, that would assume that every other actor, not necessarily a state actor, would not have any strong position or a very well-fundamented ground to stand on to oppose this bipolar worldview. And the second being that personalities don't matter that much, and I explain this. I could think of 3 states that would not approve this bipolar worldview that you suggest, or that you propose, actually. And the first one being Russia. Obviously, I don't think Russia would agree on everything Trump especially has been saying on everything. And considering that Russia is not bound, not very strongly to any international organization strategic thinking. The second being Great Britain. Given the Brexit episode, it has been weakened, yes, but the same thing has given her the freedom to act outside the strategic thinking the European Union has had for several years, and that has tended to align with the United States, thank you, foreign policy. And the third one being the United States itself, because you mentioned that even though Trump has spoken very strongly on several points, he does have opposition within his teamwork. And that poses a question, will this bipolar system will be achievable if Trump has very strong opposition within his teamwork? Because we can see, and we have seen before, that even though he might not have the power to carry out these changes he wants to perform, the sole image of him talking like this matters. And it matters towards the formulating of politics to everybody else, to every other state that has the eyes on the United States for formulating future politics.
Okay. Yeah.
Monica, I was making a slightly different point, that what we're starting to see is alliances in a very informal way. I don't mean NATO. I mean groupings trying to resist the kind of tensions that we're seeing out of the United States and out of China. But if I take the point more broadly, a country being a security ally of the United States has never stopped us from imposing economic pressure on them. Right? Japan was in 2 decades of recession because we went into Japan and said, you are going to change your economy so that we can reinflate ours in the 1980s. And they had no choice because they're completely dependent on us in security terms. So in strategic terms, we don't walk away from Japan, we don't walk away from Canada, we don't walk away from Germany. That doesn't mean we don't put them under economic pressure of a variety of types. We also rescue them during the financial crisis, et cetera. But those two things aren't precisely parallel. Okay? But I was meaning a slightly different, when I said alliance, I mean, the Germans call their thing an alliance of multilaterals, but it's kind of small a alliance. I didn't mean the capital A allied structure. On the G20, look, my big hope is that Trump stays in his hotel room and tweets and watches TV all day long. And I pray to God that he doesn't actually go out of his hotel room and actually talk to anybody, because every time he does, he says just unbelievably, amazingly stupid things. He's already been forced to walk back his desire to have a meeting with Putin, right? So here's an instance. Trump, left to his own desires, was very clear that he wanted to have a meeting with Putin at the G20, and basically the national security establishment has blocked it, and he is not going to have him. He may bump into him, but he's not having a bilateral with Putin at the G20. He is not going to see the South Korean president. That's good, because Trump doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, and when he weighs in, everything gets messed up. I sincerely doubt he will meet with the Saudis, even though by his own instinct he probably would. So I'm very happy if he just sits in his room, but he probably will meet Xi. Xi is very clever, and he's done a pretty good job of managing the relationship with Trump. And weirdly, despite what I described about the structural relation, these two leaders like each other. Trump likes Xi, and Xi likes Trump. They kind of like each other. They see themselves similar, real estate background, big man, etc. Which is sort of weird, but they do. They have a good chemistry. They built it early on. What I anticipate is that Xi and Trump will say to each other some positive things about walking back from where they are in the trade war. But they won't actually fix it in the G20. They'll say some positive things and send their negotiators back to keep negotiating. Whether that will work or not, I don't know. The U.S. trade negotiating team is a bizarro land mix of personalities. One of the key political people in the U.S. described the four people, sort of, you have Ross, Mnuchin, Lighthizer, and Navarro. A key cabinet figure in the U.S. described it for me as four idiots who misunderstand the world in four separate ways. Okay? That gives you a flavor of American politics right now. And he's right. These are four people. Mnuchin understands the global economy. He's the weakest Treasury Secretary the United States has had in modern history, but he does actually understand markets. The other guys, I don't know what they think they're doing. And they fundamentally disagree with each other. I was in Beijing when the team went to see the Chinese leadership to negotiate the last round. And they spent the entire time sitting on a bench like this, screaming at each other. Not at the Chinese, screaming at each other. Fuck you, Lighthizer, you asshole, Navarro. In front of the Chinese leadership who were staring at them like, what are we seeing here? So Trump and Xi can say nice things to each other, and yes, we'll lower tensions and we'll fix it, whatever. But the teams still have to work it out, and I don't know whether that will happen. I do anticipate that we will see a lowering of the trade tensions with China, but not necessary for a very long time. And a lowering of the trade tensions won't change one iota of the tensions in the Taiwan Straits, or the East China Sea, or the South China Sea, or the Korean Peninsula, or you name it, cyber, AI, all sorts of issues. Those tensions will continue to rise, notwithstanding Trump. Bipolarity. Countries don't have to accept a bipolar system, right? Germany didn't want to live in a bipolar world. Poland didn't want to live in a bipolar world. They just did. The United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War were simply vastly more powerful than everybody else. And we are moving rapidly to a place, the United States is already vastly more powerful than everybody else. China is getting awfully close. When you look at big global statistics, massive declines in poverty levels in the BRICS, huge, break it up. It's all China. China is in a totally different category than the other emerging powers. Now the number 2 defense spender in the world, number 2 economy in the world, number 1 energy consumer in the world, number 1 energy importer in the world, number 1 carbon emitter in the world. Just go through the list. These are the 2 big actors. And It's not true of every country, it's not true of every issue. But for most countries, on most issues, to decide what your strategy is, you have to relate to Washington's strategy, and you have to relate to Beijing's strategy. There may be another actor, you may also have to relate to India or somebody else as well, but add it up, and almost everybody has to constantly be evaluating American strategy and Chinese strategy, which for me is what is the definition of a pole. Right? It's not just that somebody has a worldview, it's that you're powerful enough that countries have to factor you into their strategy. Now, what you're describing is a spheres of influence. Will China be able to establish a sphere of influence? Will the other actors be able to establish a sphere of influence? China will try, and the United States will try to resist it. And the biggest tension we will see and the biggest structuring fact in international politics that we will see in the next 5, 10, 15 years is China trying to deepen its influence in Asia and the United States trying to resist, militarily, economically, diplomatically, politically, and in other ways. And that will factor out into Chinese investments in Germany. Chinese investments in Germany are under huge pressure from the United States saying, you should not let these guys in because we need to weaken them in Asia. Okay? Guess what will happen if Mexico tries to kind of flirt more with China? You'll see an awful lot of pressure for the United States. So countries don't have to want bipolarity. It's a fact of power. Russia, I think, is a phenomenon of bipolarity. There is no way Putin gets away with what he's doing right now if he isn't given diplomatic cover by Beijing. And every time Beijing signals, even just a little bit, that it's uncomfortable with Moscow's strategy, Moscow backs off. Putin can push the West as hard as he can because there's this much bigger factor out there, which is China, that gives him diplomatic and political and economic cover. And his entire economic strategy is China, his diplomatic strategy is China. These are two countries who do not trust each other. Once the West is weakened, they will go back to being in tension with one another. But China is also just, at this stage, much more powerful than Russia. So again, countries don't have to want bipolarity. It's simply a feature of the structure of power. And we're not quite there yet. It's just the trends that I see in the scale of difference. Let me take 30 seconds more. Artificial intelligence is going to reshape most economies. Where is the concentration of activity on artificial intelligence? Two places, the West Coast of the United States and the Shanghai corridor in China. Those two zones account for something like 96% of investment in artificial intelligence research and activity. India's a player, Japan's a player, et cetera, but the United States, China, everybody else. And artificial intelligence has big first mover advantages. So that gulf is going to grow, not shrink. So I think we're moving to a world where there are two large shaping actors who fundamentally disagree about the structure of politics, and everything else will be shaped around the reaction to that.
Celia Toro, y luego vamos. Sí.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Jones. I found it very interesting. I wonder, however, how do you imagine these two worlds that you clearly depict, the bipolar world, and this group of actors, be it cities, states, corporations, coming together and pushing against the consequences of bipolarity? It seems to me, we work with analogies all the time. You go back to thinking about a new bipolar world, and perhaps at the same time, the creation or the emergence of a neo-medieval world of multiple authorities that overlap, that compete, that coincide. But when the bipolar conflict becomes more severe, the rest disappears. So how do you picture the relationship between the two worlds?
Yes, so there were, había manos alzadas por ahí, sí.
Good afternoon. I have a question on constructive players, and especially, on the committee that is coming on this 1st of December for the presidential inauguration here in Mexico. The United States committee not only includes the vice president, but also 11 8 mayors and 5 state governors. First, would you categorize these actors as constructive players? And second, what can they do? What do you think they're doing here? Because they're not interacting with, well, they're not coming to interact with other mayors or other state governors. They're coming to see the new president of Mexico, whatever that means for them. But of course, it's important, but what can they do?
Good evening. I have 2 questions, if I may. Which is the place of India in this tense international moment, keeping in mind the government, the nationalist government of Modi and its economic importance? And the second is, what are the politics of the USA regarding the African countries and its increasing relationships with China?
So maybe.
Bon. If we see a total solidification of US-China relations into a Cold War, then all the other stuff will struggle at the very least, okay? But we're not there yet. And so what we're watching is 2 competing tendencies fighting it out. It's also, as I said, inside Washington, inside Beijing, there's still a debate. There is a debate in Washington about how far to push, and there's a debate in Xi's office about how far to push. And there are issue areas where, I mean, it's a kind of meaningless thing to talk about. How the hell do you think about climate change in a context of bipolarity? It doesn't make any sense, right? You're still going to have to find some ways to interact with the kind of world of interdependence and a world of transnational economics, at least for some considerable period of time. So I think we will see both tendencies playing out. The question for me is, which is the more powerful? Right now, if we see a rapid move towards this with US-China, the rest will be very hard to do. But if US-China remains kind of fluid, et cetera, then if we're clever on these constructive things, we can try to limit the scope, okay? There's a European or American story, this fingers in the dike, is that a phrase that resonates? When the dam is breaking, sometimes you simply have to patch the dam, right? Eventually you need to rebuild it, but for a while you just patch it. These things are patches for now. They're not an answer, but they can be patches. Pence delegation, look, I would take it seriously. Pence is a very odd guy, and on any social issue, I have to say I find him horrendous. But on every foreign policy issue, he's completely normal. He really is. He's a completely normal guy on alliance structure, on free trade, on governance issues. He's a completely normal guy. And he's quite powerful, actually, much more powerful than people imagine inside the White House. And even if you just take it as a political signal, the fact of coming with those mayors, with those state governors, et cetera, is a very good sign in terms of an effort, a deliberate effort, actually, to continue this kind of constellation of constructive players that I talked about during NAFTA. This is them. This is that group of players who helped to stop the president from doing narrowly what he would have done left to his own devices and to have a more constructive approach. So I think it's well worthwhile for Mexico to engage seriously with that group of people who are coming and with Pence himself. It would be a very good outcome for Mexico if Pence left feeling like he had a role in the stewardship of the US-Mexico relationship. That would be a very good outcome for Mexico in the next couple of years. Washington is about to get much more complicated, much more screwed up, and much more difficult than it's been for the last couple of years. Having somebody whose job is not threatened, who has standing and is sane as an interlocutor, those are 3 things that are hard to find right now in the same person in Washington. To have an interlocutor like that would be a very good thing for Mexico. India, a very interesting set of questions. I actually think when we look back on this period of time, we're going to spend a lot of time studying the way India and China relate to one another, right? These 2 countries are already in shooting wars with one another. They are in deep strategic tension with one another, and their economic ties are deepening, not weakening, deepening. And they have figured out, at least so far, how to manage those two realities simultaneously. I think the most benign scenario that we can foresee is if the rest of the major powers figure out that same thing. My worry is that we won't. My worry is that the kind of strategic tensions will drive the entire relationships. We'll be much better off if we find ways to do essentially what India and China do, which is to contain the strategic tensions to the strategic sphere and allow economic relationships to continue and to deepen and to build and et cetera. So yes, there's a contradiction between Modi's nationalism and India's economic position, but that's kind of the new structure of geopolitics, and it's quite interesting to me to see it play out. Africa. The United States is capable of thinking of three things at the same time, sometimes two. Africa would be like six, okay? So there is no thinking about Africa. Every now and again, somebody notices that the Chinese are investing a lot in Africa, and they're like, oh my God, we got to invest in Africa too, and then they pass a bill, and then nothing happens. The United States is not going to be a driving fact in Africa. If I'm a little bit more optimistic, I would say the following two things. First of all, there's quite a lot of Chinese investment in Africa that's quite good, right? There's Chinese investment that's bad, but there's also quite a lot that's quite good. There are a lot of other investors in Africa. The Japanese, the Indians, the Europeans are all big investors in Africa. What I would love to see, because I'm a Canadian and so I'm an optimist and I'm multilaterally minded, I would love to see all these players working together to create a kind of race to the top. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a race to the bottom, where everybody tries to erode their own standards faster than everybody else so they can compete with Chinese investment. 10 years ago, Canadian natural resources investment in Africa was relatively high quality investment. Not now. Now we're just as willing as the Chinese to ignore human rights or gender issues, whatever, because they're winning. So the negative scenario is a race to the bottom. The more benign scenario would be a kind of competitive race to the top. Fortunately, I think enough African countries are, one of the realities and the features of the last 25 years is it 60 countries that moved from low income to middle income status? Quite a lot of economic growth, quite a lot of political development. 15 years ago or 25 years ago, if the United States and China were competing on infrastructure investments in Mozambique, it would be a complete race to the bottom. Right now, Mozambique has the capacity to say, well, hold on a second, we're going to push back a little bit here and there. And the African Union has quite a lot of competency as well. So I'm not so worried about this issue in Africa. I think on balance, the fact of substantial Chinese investment is good for Africa, and the geopolitical tensions for now, it's not the main place that this stuff is going to be. We have many, many other fights to fight before we worry about Chinese investment in Africa.
¿Había más preguntas ahí? Sí. Ahí.
Hi. My question is, which is the role of the One Road, One Belt China policy in this context you're presenting us? Supposedly, it's aimed to promote multilateralism. In my opinion, politically speaking, it's obvious its major goal is to strengthen China. So, in this sense, wouldn't it help enhance bipolarity? And even if it has a goodwill for multilateralism, would it really be significant for this movement?
Okay. Let's see.
Well, my question is, what do you think is the role of education, like in these bodies that you taught?
The role of?
What is the role of education?
Education.
Yes. Like in the different bodies that you were talking about, like cities, civil society, states to multilateral institutions, in making these two powers more allies than a Cold War enemies type?
Good afternoon. My question goes through fintech. Like, what would be the role for civil society? That I have seen that there are like many little companies and associations that have like these solidarity movements around fintech. So what would be the role of that against the big weights of China and the United States investing in artificial intelligence?
In reverse order. I think quite a lot of the issues, I would put fintech and actually education. Well, I know you asked a slightly different question about education, I'll go back to it, but in the broader sense, education, into a space by shorthand on sustainable development goals, okay? Places where you had a pretty interesting politics of reaching a global agreement around a number of goals. Personally, I think they're massively too ambitious or too many, but so what? You have a good politics around it. They have become a place where corporations, multilaterals, civic actors, philanthropic actors have mobilized. And so far, I don't really see either the United States or China trying to interfere with that. It's sort of happening below the level of the clash of the titans, so to speak. It could change if we really dive deep into a nasty Cold War, but I think that's a long way off. So this is, again, where I think we will see this space of kind of much more constructive, interconnected, cooperative efforts that are not driven by the United States, not driven by China. They're driven by businesses, Scandinavian governments, multilateral institutions, et cetera, and quite a lot that's happening there, which is quite positive and quite constructive. And sort of annoying strategic type like me in Washington don't screw it up yet. We might get there, but not yet. And so I think there's quite a lot of positive in that domain. Same in the education sector. You were also asking, though, whether education could play a role in forestalling the worst of the Cold War. It's not obvious to me how. If you think about who drives policymaking in Washington and Beijing, it's hyper-educated elites. I don't think it's not as if, oh, there's a lack of education and knowledge. There is a lack of understanding of the United States and China. There's a lack of understanding of China and the United States. That's true. But I'm not sure I see sort of education as a pathway that's going to get us there, certainly not in time. There are, and even I think a lot about the fact that, when at the height of the Cold War, there were 20,000 PhDs in the United States with a background in Russian studies. Right now, there are about 2,000 on China. So clearly, we have a lack of intellectual capability on China. But it's not as if having 20,000 PhDs on the Soviet Union stopped us from being in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. It just allowed us for greater sophistication in our efforts to counter them, right? So I don't necessarily see an alignment between education on the one hand and that kind of strategic competition on the other. On One Belt, One Road, is it multilateral or is it designed to strengthen China? Both. We shouldn't assume that multilateralism is necessarily purely cooperative. I know I set up an opposition between kind of strategic rivalry on the one hand and multilateral on the other. But if you think about the way most multilateral institutions were formed in the 1940s to 50s, it was formed by us to advance our interests. Now, I think in a benign interpretation, it was our interests with a reasonably win-win kind of philosophy. We win more and you win less, but we still win-win. Not all strategy is like that. But multilateralism isn't necessarily disadvantaging of the actor that's advancing it, right? The United States gains a huge amount by driving multilateral institutions. So one part of what China is doing is trying to put itself in the position the United States is being in as one of the drivers of multilateralism, and that's to China's advantage. I think what we've seen, though, is we have actually 3 different frameworks for China to invest in infrastructure. One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese National Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. By any measure, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a very high standards multilateral institution. Do you know how much money has been spent through the AIIB so far? $0. all of the spending is through the Chinese National Bank. The Chinese National Bank is not a multilateral institution designed to foster human rights or good governance or high standards or anything remotely like it, right? So this is, again, this double play, right? You've got an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, everybody joins, you have big conferences, you have high standards, but you don't spend any money. And you do it all through your national bank in a very different kind of a way. It's both, but I would put the balance on Chinese interests.
Okay. ¿Había más? ¿O sí? ¿Sería?
How to explain the abandonment of TPP by Trump in this major bipolar world?
¿Hay más preguntas? Sí, por favor. Dos más. Sí. Tres más.
Yes, it will be very, very brief, I hope. You mentioned, of course, constructive actors such as cities, states, civil society, and corporations. However, I suppose these are constructive actors towards a multilateral world order. However, are there actors at the same level which rather wish to construct or to speed up this movement towards a bilateral world order? That's it, really. There's nothing more. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. You mentioned in your presentation that Asia's strategy is sort of to push the US away from the region. And we've seen this approach by China's participation in regional organizations and also by the infrastructure investment. So in which of these arenas do you think the clash between the US and China would occur more profoundly?
My question is thinking about geopolitics and especially about China with their military advancement on the South China Sea and the Taiwan question. This retreat of the United States towards itself, what's going to make, what does that mean for Taiwan? What does that mean for the islands in the East China Sea that China sees as part of their, sovereign territories and one whole continental territory?
Bon. TPP. It's very important to recognize that during the election, Hillary Clinton also walked away from TPP. Hillary Clinton. Okay? During the campaign, she said, even though she negotiated it, that she would walk away from TPP. I talked to her main foreign policy advisor and I said, please tell me that's just some campaign bullshit. He said, no, we will walk away from TPP. Why? Because politics in the United States, the election result we saw, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, the Elizabeth Warren phenomenon, is, as I think there's a dimension of politics here, the fight between those people who are winning from globalization and those people who are left out of globalization. What Hillary's people said to me is, if we pass TPP, the next time there's a Democratic primary, we will have a Trump that will win the Democratic primary. In other words, politically, she didn't believe that they could sustain a central position on free trade. And Trump is already, of course, a populist. Now, so this is where the kind of populist politics of the contemporary United States is in deep tension with strategic thinking in the United States. To a person, to a man and a woman in the financial establishment, the political establishment, and the security establishment, they would have passed TPP. And I would not rule out that we get back there. I wouldn't rule out that we go back there, okay? A lot of the kinds of people I'm discussing, including Brookings, frankly, did a lot of the work to help the Japanese craft the TPP-11 with a docking station where the US could come back in when and if the politics change. That may take some time, but it would be the obvious strategy, right? I know what you mean. I use the word constructive differently, okay? But I know what you mean. Are there actors trying to hasten? Well, yes, Navarro, Xi Jinping, President. So there are core actors in the U.S. administration. There are core actors in the Chinese leadership. I don't really see other actors trying to foster that. If you're Japan, if it's going to happen, then you goddamn hope the United States is going to be serious at your defense, but it's an awfully risky strategy to hasten it. So if you see it as inevitable, then you're working very hard to kind of solidify your security alliance with the United States. But you're not trying to hasten that scenario because it's a very, very dangerous scenario. So I don't really see other actors trying to push it. Not even the Russians, because that's not what the Russians are trying to do. The Russians are trying to pull down the West. That doesn't mean they're trying to build up China or see a bipolar system, right? That's not so good for them either. I don't think they'll have any choice. How will China try to push the United States out of Asia? So one is economic. China is now the largest investor in every Asian country. The United States is the #2 investor. It's not like we're going away, but the United States is #1. China has deep political ties in several of these countries, Taiwan, etc. China is behaving the way we behaved in the 1950s, tons of bribery, et cetera, political assassinations, things like that to intimidate people to move positions. But that's not the core of where they will push or try to push the United States. Where they will try to push it is Navy to Navy, submarine to submarine, battle group to battle group, okay? If you watch the deployment of US naval assets and the deployment of Chinese naval assets, they are doing this every single day, okay? They are just missing each other deliberately on the South China Sea, on the East China Sea, on Laos. This is a Navy-to-Navy, hard power to hard power fight. The regional organizations, the investment stuff is the kind of economic penumbra of it. It's part of the game, but the core of the game is hard power to hard power, or my colleague Bob Kagan calls dumb power to dumb power, which I think is a good terminology for understanding the dynamics of those two systems, right? It's just pure old-fashioned metal-on-metal geopolitics. What happens to Taiwan if we retreat? Well, first of all, let's be clear. People talk about the American retreat, etc. I don't know. Yesterday, we sailed 5 destroyers through the Taiwan Straits. I sincerely doubt the Chinese feel like that's American retreat, okay? We're going to increase our defense spending. About 80% of that increase is going to go to Asia. We have 500 bases overseas. This notion of American retreat, I think, is kind of a bizarre one, frankly. I don't see the United States retreating. Yes, we have gone from this insanely high number of troops in the Middle East that came after the 9/11 back to only 2 or 3 times larger than what we had during the Cold War. Retreat? I don't see American retreat. I see stupidity, I see bad strategy, I see craziness, TPP decisions, etc. But I don't see retreat in the sense that it's referred to, and certainly not in geopolitical terms. And I think we'll see an increase, not a decrease, in American posture. Now that could change very quickly. It's interesting to watch on the Democratic Party. The kind of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party is definitely sort of flirting with why the hell should we be in Asia? Why should we spend this kind of politics? That's the same as Trump's rhetoric, but Trump hasn't implemented that at all. But Trump has no idea how to handle the distance between his policy and the administration's. Somebody like Elizabeth Warren would have a much better capacity to shape the system to her views. So you could see that change. If the United States were in a meaningful sense to retreat, Taiwan is totally screwed. The Chinese will take Taiwan like that if they think they can get away with it. But beyond that, it's much more complicated for them. I mean, it's nice for the Chinese to want to have a sphere of influence, but the next thing over is Japan. Japan's navy is just as powerful as China's. It's not going anywhere. South Korea has an army that can take on the Chinese in a push. Vietnam can take on the Chinese in a push. So it's actually a very tricky play in sort of Chinese hard power terms. So I see, that's not a pathway of frictionless Chinese gains. That's a pathway of nuclearization and of intense friction and militarized clashes. The day after Trump was elected, I had South Korean intelligence peoples in my office asking me how the United States would respond if South Korea went nuclear. Right? So you're seeing already key actors in the region reassessing the geopolitical moment that they're in and contemplating a shift to a very different posture on issues like nuclear power. Right? So that's the pathway if the US retreats. It's not a benign pathway. It's not a Chinese sphere of influence. It's a conflict pathway. That's probably a really bad point on which to end, but anyway, it's probably, but you held a question here, we had this, yes.
Yeah, Gustavo?
And I'm afraid of this question because we talked in the morning, so we've had several hours to prepare.
No, I was just want to ask you if you could give us some sense. You said that there is no strategy towards Mexico and Latin America because of we are not members of the alliance. But on the other hand, there are very important issues. That we have the NAFTA, the new agreement, is still in the process of being adopted or not, given the midterm election, etc. You already gave an answer this morning, but the students don't know. But how do you see security, the border issues, and Central America's caravans? And as you know, the new government is going to propose the creation of a funding, I think they're talking about $20 billion in order to develop Central America as a way to really tackle the issue of preventing this migration from there. So I think President Trump has not adopted any position. He seems to be in a sort of, somehow he hasn't taken a position towards these kind of issues. That's another issue, security. And what about migration? Migration now, for what I have read, the Democrats might try now to pass a bill in which at least the DACA, the Dreamers, will be recognized permanently. How do you see the migration policies developing in the future, security, and the economic relationship between Mexico, United States, and Canada in the future? And another one, the Middle East you didn't mention. What is the likelihood of a resolution of the conflict between Palestine and Israel now that President Trump has decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem? Apparently that makes the two-state solution probably impossible for the future. How do you see that developing?
Okay, bueno, tenemos dos preguntas y medio. Entonces, media pregunta.
I just have one more question. I wonder, because this is like who's stronger and who's the most heavy country. So when Merkel and Macron are like cutting ties with some ties, I don't know how many, with the United States, where are they going and what is like their weight in these movements we are talking about?
Yeah, good. Yeah. I'm going to do it in reverse order. I think the only silver lining for the United States in our current stupidity is that the answer to your question is they have nowhere else to go. What are you going to do? Forge a strategic alliance with China? No, it's a meaningless concept. And so you can be as pissed off as you want at the United States right now if you're Germany or if you're France. But Putin is still right there, and you're not going to want to ally with Xi, so what choice do you have? So you complain, you get pissed off, and you know what you do? You increase the size of your defense spending, because Trump told you to, which is what the Germans just decided to do yesterday. It's not a strategy I like. I'm not defending Trump. But I think the reality of international politics is such that for France, for Germany, for Canada, there's nowhere else to go. So you're either in a values-based, benign, positive alliance with the United States, or you're in a much narrower security alliance with the United States. But there's no third choice. And Europe isn't going to have its own army and this stuff. That's just fiction. Middle East. chances of an Israel-Palestine deal while Mohammed Abbas and Netanyahu are in office were 0 before Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and they're 0 after Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, I think, weakened the American posture as a negotiator, but I don't think it actually is a structural impediment to a two-state solution. They just have to take the second decision, which they were very close to taking, and I think they will when they do their plan, which is to accept that the capital of Palestine is also in Jerusalem. Everybody knows in the end, I mean, if you look at the Clinton parameters and everything else, in the end, both countries have their capital in Jerusalem. That's understood to be where this ends. The decision to advance it as policy was a surprising one, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the structure. The problem is a much deeper one of a kind of erosion of politics supporting the two-state solution in both camps. The other thing I have to be frank in saying is that what we have seen across the Arab world is that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is, it's number 4 on the talking points now. It's not the number 1 issue. When the Saudis or the Jordanians or the Egyptians come to see Trump, they're not talking about Israel-Palestine, they're not talking about the Middle East peace process. If it comes up at all, it's sort of a distant issue. They're talking about Iran, they're talking about the GCC fight, and they're forging, frankly, call a spade, they're forging a tactical alliance with Israel. Saudi and Egypt and Israel are in a tactical alliance against Iran. And they don't give a shit about the Palestinians, frankly put. So I'm not very optimistic about the Middle East peace process, sorry. Latin America and strategy, Central America, migration, etc. In a normal American administration, the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere is the President, right? When the Assistant Secretary says, this is the way we're going to go, that's the way we go. Because nobody above the Assistant Secretary knows anything about it or cares. So, and that's a good thing, right? US policy works well when Assistant Secretaries have a lot of influence and space and power. If you're the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, you are the President of the United States vis-a-vis Africa. And same thing for Western Hemisphere. Not on trade, because that involves Congress, but on strategy, security issues, etc. But this is not a normal moment in the United States. How long did we go before we had an Assistant Secretary, confirmed Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere? 2.5 years, 2 years? I don't know, crazy amounts of time. And decision-making inside State Department is so screwed up that the notion that an Assistant Secretary of State in this particular moment can have an effective strategy is just meaningless. It can't be done. Which means that issues have to rise up to the level of the cabinet, which means that you're competing with Iran, North Korea, China, Saudi, Russia. In other words, you're not even on the long list, let alone the short list, okay? Central America will become higher up the list for all negative reasons. Trump will deliberately manipulate the issue for base politics. He will not be trying to solve the problem. He will be manipulating the problem for political effect. Now, the institutions, USAID and State Department and Defense Department, et cetera, will try to be helpful on these issues. But when the president is actively intervening in a negative way, it's very difficult to stop it in the context that we described. So unfortunately, I think in the next couple of years, we'll see very negative dynamics around the migration issue and the Central America issues. Over time, I can see lots of scope for collaboration, but only when we're in a very different political moment in the United States. So last point, because it's also a slightly optimistic one. I am often wrong, so don't take it to the bank. But as I read the politics, I think that NAFTA will pass, NAFTA 2.0. I think it will pass. And it'll pass because even though the Democratic House is a slightly anti-free trade house, there was such revulsion in the establishment against what Trump did to Mexico. The way he talked about the issue, how insulting he was, the stupidity of the wall, the stupidity of all this kind of stuff. And the outcomes of the NAFTA negotiation are not seen as a victory for Trump. They're seen as Trump having been forced back to a much more limited stance. So I think we will see the administration wanting to pass a deal and a Democratic House going along, even though it's not a particularly pro-free trade house, because it's seen as a kind of contained Trump versus celebrated Trump move. So on balance, I'm reasonably optimistic about NAFTA 2.0.
Bueno, muchas por esa visión panorámica del estado del mundo en este momento. Gracias a ustedes por las preguntas, muy, muy interesantes preguntas. Bien.